All right. Awesome. Hi, everybody. This is Danelli. I'm going to be talking a little bit about PhD programs. Yay. I have one other video on the cost of a bachelor's degree at a UC. And then I have the video on the cost of a terminal master's program. And so decided to kind of end this like three-part series with a video on the cost of attending a PhD program, what it is, what it's all about, what it includes, and what are some resources, what's it useful for, is it worth it, is it not worth it, and realistically, what can students expect, and what should potential students consider if they are thinking about like jumping into a PhD program. So, um, I'm actually using my own, l- you know, sort of like admissions offer from UC Irvine. I did redact the year it was offered, and sort of like the quarter that I started for a little bit of anonymity, for the sake of a little bit of anonymity. But for the most part, I am showing a little bit of what these sort of admissions offer letters look like. And, I want to start off with like a little bit of a disclaimer. First of all, if you guys notice like something that's a red flag and you have a bit more experience than I do with like, you know, this kind of program, and or you think something maybe doesn't seem fair because you're enrolled in a different program and you guys are in a union that actually managed to get you guys a better like deal, or whatever like you think might be a red flag in this offer, please do not hesitate in like sending me a message or a comment or posting it on the comment section, because no two schools are the same. Some of these letters are pretty standard. However, occasionally we do see that like some things might not be as fair as we think they are. So again, as I go through this, if you notice something, a discrepancy or a red flag, please let me know. I am going to be pointing out a few things that I think are or should have been red flags in retrospect. I'm not going to hold back given the state of the circumstance right now, with like education and like PhD programs. So that being said, let us continue. My offer letter is pretty standard from what I can tell. And from what I've learned, other students, are like have gotten and like are what their like financial situation is and what they're struggling with. Um, so how does a PhD program work, right? Usually you have like a contract offered to you, an admissions offer, which is constitutes a contract that will run anywhere between 5 years. That's the standard right now, 5 or 6 years. Most programs are about 5 years. And they will offer you like tuition coverage, health insurance, um, and like some support, like an advisor will usually help you like start working on your pre-dissertation research and offer to give you time and space to like do dissertation research. Um, During those 5 years, you have about 2 years of coursework that's required. And a lot of programs, what they're doing now in order to like sweeten the deal, especially if people know very early on that they want to do a PhD program, um, they will offer like a master's degree on top of or like attached to the PhD. However, like a lot of these programs don't take into consideration that generally a lot of people will enroll in terminal master's programs before they go into a PhD, because there is a bit of a difference between what you learn in a master's terminal program and what you actually are exposed to in just the first 2 years of a PhD program that's that they will give you a master's certificate for. From what I've noticed, the biggest differences are in terms of how much, like the kind of work, practical work that you're doing with certain kinds of demographics. I had a bigger opportunity to work with community college demographics in Southern California while I was doing my master's terminal program. And I'm not going to lie, you oftentimes do not have the same practical experience teaching or working with students, you know, as a PhD student that's going to be receiving a master's certification or program or degree attached to, right, the PhD. So there is that kind of difference. I think that for the most part, from what I've noticed, master's terminal programs do offer you a little bit more exposure to pedagogy, like actual teaching methods and methodology and philosophy to actually work with like a broader range of demographics. And, I'm gonna try to be really candid with you guys that a lot of PhD students that are enrolled in PhD programs and like teach for are teaching assistants for universities, the demographics there at 4-year universities like UC, Irvine or University of California campuses, that those kinds of demographics are very different than like the different community colleges demographics. And um because the PhD students often in these programs don't have the same exposure to like working with certain demographics in community colleges, it's going to be like a mismatch of like how much actual teaching experience they end up with by the time they graduate. So keep that in mind if you're considering like jumping from a bachelor's degree to a PhD program that includes a master's program. Why do you want to enroll in a PhD program? Is it to be like, is it to learn practical teaching skills? What kind of teacher do you want to be? Do you want to be teaching composition, or do you want to be teaching themed courses that are more geared towards like research or critical thinking skills or other kinds of like fields? And what kind of student demographics do you ideally want to work with? Because there is a difference in the kind of like actual work you get qualified for, you get experience working with, and like what you end up getting prepared to do. That being said, why a lot of students end up, even though they have a master's terminal program degree, why they end up going into a PhD generally involves job security. A lot of times, if markets become very saturated or impacted, the higher the qualified candidate, the better the chance that they will actually get hired either at a community college or a university. So, having that qualification of a PhD will improve your chances of getting hired at a broader range of institutions, and also will help you like go into like tenure track or administrative track type of career, in relation to whatever field you're in. So keep that in mind, like where you want to take your career and like what the practicality of getting the PhD degree is, like why is it practical for you? So you want to consider that. Um so like a PhD program really is going to have you do a few years of coursework, 2, 3 years of coursework. Then you start bridging into pre-dissertation work. Then you start bridging into like dissertation work. And I'm gonna like walk a little bit through this sort of like admissions offer letter. They give you the standard spiel, like welcome to, the school. This is a program, this is what your offer is. And like I said, they cover full tuition costs and fees. So essentially, you're going to school. Yes, you might be incurring some debt for some of the time, Especially, and I notice this for myself and a lot of individuals, especially if like, you know, you need to do a little bit of refinancing because the like finance your finances have been shifting or changing because of your academic or career goals. Yeah, you can still like do a little bit of like refinancing with your loans and to try to like make it work. But usually your tuition is going to be covered, the fees are going to be covered, and the offers will include health insurance. Why this is standard is because being a PhD student is essentially a job. They are they need to it's always you have to think about it in terms of like a broader economic sense. Like, why is it useful to still have these programs like running and like preparing PhD students? Because eventually, like the next generation that retires is gonna need to get like their positions filled, and you need to start preparing people to fill those positions, you know, and be able to have them work pretty much anywhere where they qualify, if not just nationally, but usually internationally as well. Um, so like this is why they want to sweeten the deal, right? They want you to like if you're going to venture into a PhD program, they want to cover your tuition, they want to cover your fees, they want to cover your health insurance, and they want to offer you some sort of funding or like employment situation where like it relieves some of the financial burden of continuing to be enrolled as a student, because the longer you are as a student and getting these qualifications under your belt, the less you're working out in the market and the less you're earning. So really like straddling both worlds becomes really, really hard. So like, hey, they kind of want to make sure that like they're relieving some of the burden for you and sweetening the deal when you're enrolling into like a program like this. Not only that, you have to consider that they're trying to rope you in here for 5+ years. So imagine what you could be doing with just a master's degree. Um, Even just in a community college setting, you start getting your classes, you give yourself the time to, get classes, and you give yourself the time to maybe even just be a substitute, to be honest, right? Like if you're substitute teaching in the meantime to pay your bills, and you're doing that full time, you're totally able to have a decent salary. Um, or you're still like working in a different field and like you're taking your time to transitioning. If you're kind of like, not in the job market 100% because you're tied up with this kind of a program for 5+ years in the future, it can be extremely harmful economically for you as an individual. And so what they do is like, hey, we're trying to sweeten the deal here, like so that you become enrolled in this program. Because like I said, let's face it, you can actually end up making quite a lot of money in like per furthering your career outside of an academic setting independently. You never know. A lot of people end up founding companies instead of enrolling in PhD programs, and they become millionaires. So this offer is really for a lot of people that have certain kinds of skills and experience and they have a network. These kinds of offers are a little bit laughable, right? And so what they try to do is kind of say, hey, like you won't have to pay for school if you enroll. Your tuition and fees are going to be covered. You will get health insurance. The health insurance is, for the full year, so it's not necessarily bad. And then like, your premiums might be pretty like low. You won't have to pay much. Um, and then they oftentimes will offer you some kind of like employment situation or additional funding to like help you make it through. And this is the part where it's a little bit tricky for a lot of people in a lot of schools, and I've noticed that the controversy continues and is continuing to get worse with a lot of like graduate programs. Um, they don't really offer you much when they do offer you employment. Um, like per year, the pay for 20 hours on average is okay. However, remember your work, like you are attending school full time, trying to finish courses full time. You're at the same time like trying to meet the requirements of your academic program. And then you're working an additional 20 hours as an employee or a graduate student researcher. If these contracts are considered like full-time employment for the span of 5 years, then you're being overworked by an average of 20 hours per week when the school season starts, because we have always known, and they hammer this into you when you're a freshman and you first going into college or university, that attending school full time, 3, 4 courses per quarter per semester is full-time work. You should not be dedicating yourself to anything else, as a full-time student. So when they throw in here that, you have the opportunity to work at 50% capacity or 20 hours a week or whatever it is, every graduate student that goes into it knows and should know, and I'm making this video for this reason, right? You should know that you're being overworked by at least 20 hours per week. There's no doubt about it. Like if you're a full-time student, the first couple years of a PhD program, and you're working for a school, they're overworking you because these contracts are work contracts. You're being taken out of the employment market and put into like this program because you're preparing to fill in the shoes of people that either retiring or new positions that are opening up. But these are employment contracts, and being in school full time is still full time work. So, like, even when they give you this funding offer of employment, just know you're being overworked. Even though they're offering you some pay, the pay that they're offering you might not even be, if you do the math, it might not actually be what they're offering you, because when you're being worked overtime, you get time and a half, at a regular job. So you want to do the math on that. And that's just like, to be honest and really blunt, because a lot of people want to glorify going into a PhD program, and like they, they want to cover reality with rose-colored glasses, or a lot of schools want to make students feel like you should be grateful that you even got this offer. I'm here to say that it's not all that great, because if you do the math, we are essentially being overworked for what we're being offered. Not only that, you want to also consider inflation. I actually met somebody that was like older, getting divorced and getting a PhD, like in one of the campuses once, and like she was she was saying how, students band together and they try to make the best out of these poverty situations, but the reality is, that, for example, her parents in her generation were able to buy a house with this kind of an offer. So the salary was equivalent to an actual full-time salary, right? This employment salary allowed this student parents to buy a house. So if the salary that we're being offered as graduate students, for this employment, aside from, like the tuition and the health insurance and all of that, if this salary is not enough to buy us a house, we know that these offers are way below what they should be, because inflation hasn't been taken into consideration, right? So you want to open your eyes to that reality if you're jumping into this, because while it's still worth it in the long run, in the short run, you need to be aware that like this is what it's like. And you need to strategize in case this part of your contract doesn't falls through and doesn't, for whatever political reason, doesn't end up happening, because these contracts do have a provision at the end that say, as any contract, you want to read this with a little bit of legalese, like finesse here, right? These terms and conditions are subject to change as a result of action by federal and or state government or the administration of the University of California. This is a loophole they get away with. Okay, so a lot of times where students get hit is this sort of funding offer. Sure, they're offering you a PhD program free of charge, but we're not going to pay you an actual salary and we're not going to offer you work. You're going to have to figure out on your own how you're going to make a living during this time. Even though this is here, technically, you want to make sure that you're aware that this is a problem. Now, I look at these contracts myself from through the lens of my experience as a legal assistant. And something that a lot of students need to be aware of is that because these are still employment contracts, you're still able to, apply for your any kind of like additional government support. So food stamps, unemployment, if you qualify. If you do end up working 1 or 2 years for the university, you can still apply for unemployment. Remember that you can still, if there's something that goes wrong, consult an attorney. 100% consult two attorneys, consult three if you need to. Because technically these are contracts, number one. Number two, the employment situation still qualifies potentially if you have an issue as a workers' compensation issue. So remember that. Um, I also want to point out that these like contracts, if you start having an issue with this and you need to consult a contract attorney, which I would again recommend, keep in mind that even though they have these provisions at the bottom, right, like terms and conditions are subject to change, we're living in a economy that and a country, thankfully, that protects citizens from being taken advantage of from predatory institutions, organizations, and employers and individuals. So if you were offered a contract like this and you are having issues with the employment section or any other section of this, remember that technically, if entrapment is entrapment. So if they're offering you all of these great things and then they start pulling back, it's no better than living with an abusive person that's gaslighting you and like love bombing you and then decides like I'm going to take away benefits from this relationship. It's not okay, and you need to be aware that this is an issue and consult an attorney, because entrapment, especially one that locks you in for 5+ years in a situation like this, is extremely financially harmful. So you want to open your eyes to that. They do have provisions for like how this works. They give you pay scales and all of that good stuff. Remember that these contracts again can be incredibly misleading if you're not aware that there are union issues that, need to be considered if you're going to be working for the university. Keep an eye out on that. You know, things can change, as in my situation, with when you start taking like student union or employee unions into consideration. Um, they do like have different provisions for non-California residents and international students. I don't really want to go into the international student situation. I could probably have some of my classmates talk about that, but yeah, it's a dicey situation when you're an international student, especially right now because the visa situation is so complicated and the DACA situation is so complicated that like I really don't want to jump into that. It's going to be a really long tangent that I would have to do an entire other video for. I do think that Latinos, would benefit from that, so I will keep it in mind for future video. If you have questions, comments, or concerns regarding that, please do make a comment. Um, so yeah, like I won't go too much into like non-California residents or international students, but I will say if you are an international student and you want to do a PhD program um at any university in the US right now, like but God bless your heart. And I'm sending you like strength from where I'm at. Because it's particularly tough. So the funding offer, like they will try to sweeten the deal for the first year. They will sometimes offer you like additional stipends, etc. Um, again, I don't think these individuals sometimes they haven't taken inflation into account because even when you get every single bit of financial like aid and funding, the reality is that you're being locked in for 5+ years and you're being underpaid and you're on top of it incurring debt to finish this degree to qualify for certain kinds of jobs in the future. So, you know, yes, this is very exciting. But remember these numbers might seem pretty big, but this is only like a 1 or 2 year deal. And realistically, the cost of living in a state like California is quite expensive. Housing offer. So, it's a huge commitment to enroll in a PhD program. And oftentimes, a lot of students are coming in from out of state or um, there's a number of reasons why, they would benefit from working close or living close to campus where they're working and attending school. I've done it in the past and it's actually great, especially if you're like having like transportation issues or you don't want to like leave campus or you're having a particularly tough time transitioning into like full-time academic work again for whatever reason. um and or you're starting to family plan. You might actually be expanding your family while you're a PhD student a lot because again, these end up being much older students sometimes and they have full lives and some of them are married and some of them have kids. They do want to sweeten the deal and like open you up to, like settling into the community to offer you some kind of stability despite like these offers not always taking every hardship into consideration. They want to make sure that they can try to offer you some housing. And a lot of times in comparison to maybe like a terminal master's program, that's one of the benefits of enrolling directly into a PhD program is that like you do have a slightly bigger chance or better chance at getting housing through a 4 year university if you're a graduate student or PhD student. So that's one of the differences. They do offer you housing, guaranteed offer of placement on campus. You can, take up this offer right away and like stay there. You can move out and then like pick it up later, I believe. So like if you change your mind and you want to go back to living on campus, you can. There's a lot of reasons why students would choose not to. Personally, even when I'm living off of campus and I have my own place, um, I think that, first of all, it depends on what kind of research you're doing and the realities of like living on campus means that you're still subject to certain rules and like conditions of, like certain like umbrella supervision by the campus or the university. For example, some of the material that I research is quite controversial. So, you know, the fact that like internet gets monitored or, housing, sometimes maintenance might not necessarily be on the same page with the students. And we all know graduate students like sleep at random hours, are in and out at random hours. So that kind of a situation can get really, really stressful, even living on your own and like dealing with maintenance, dealing with like, having enough privacy to do certain types of research. Um, and like having stability, all of that you need to take into consideration because it might not always be the same living on campus as in like living off campus. So yeah, consider that. Um, they like try to kind of say like your admission status is provisional. Basically, like you have to keep up your grades. Um, and like you have to meet like they are pretty flexible. Like if you need a little bit of extra time to finish certain like checkpoints in your degree, they will generally adjust and like try to figure out funding for you and like help you out some way, somehow to like doing more than 5 years because research is taking longer for your dissertation or whatnot. Um, but remember, like keeping up your grades, keeping up your progress, at least maintaining steady progress is like what they're asking you to do. Um, and then they give you like roadmaps, they give you course catalogs, which usually you can get at your department's website anyways, and description of courses. And you can be in touch with your graduate advisors or multiple advisors. And at the end, you have your terms and conditions. So, there are a couple things that like this kind of touches on, but I want to make sure that I talk about in this video because I think it's incredibly important. You need to make sure you're on top of your financial aid. We don't want to make, like accuse anyone of anything, but I've actually been in educational settings where I've had like white collar crime going on and grants were stolen and library funding like was stolen and it became like a huge scandal at one institution where I attended. And usually, if something feels weird about the financial situation, the numbers are not adding up. It's looking kind of shady. My advice, consult an attorney, start to file complaints start to file complaints with the education department, start to file complaints with the actual institution organization, double check all the numbers, keep records. If it looks shady, if it feels shady, and people are not answering questions clearly and accurately like they should be, especially for a university and institution of this prestige, you bet your bottom dollar something is wrong because it should never feel like things are being like things are ambiguous or like you're not getting the answers that you need or things are not clear. It should always be clear. People should be able to answer your questions clearly. And something to keep in mind though is that there are hidden provisions that they don't warn you of and you want to make sure you're on top of. So um, one of the things that a lot of people recommended off Reddit, for example, and Reddit is a wonderful like a resource that I recommend to a lot of students that are going into graduate work. Um, somebody like said if you're going to take out loans, make sure your tuition fees get paid first so that your loan situation doesn't get like tangled up and like you don't get held back, like your money doesn't get held back for any reason and you just disperse your money sooner because that way all the like numbers are at zero and all they got to do is disperse your funding. Um, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of students decide to move out of campus housing is because again, housing on campus seems to think that they are a priority and they should get paid first out of like all your bills, they want to charge themselves almost a month and a half ahead. And so, if you're getting loans in September, you're often being charged ahead of time for September rent and October rent. So what are you actually getting dispersed in terms of loans? Not much, right? Which is like kind of a problem for a lot of students if they need to have access to money in September because they need to buy books, because they need to start booking, you know, um, flights or start paying for conference fees or whatever it is to do professional development work related to the PhD. So keep that in mind that some of these like financial award and like loop like policies or like different types of basically issues are hidden in there and you're gonna have to figure that out as you go. Um, Something else that I think students don't realize is if they like max out their student loans at the beginning of the year for whatever reason, and they maxed out their award for employment or for tuition or for graduate research work, that if you get like allotted a grant through the school has to legally pay down your loans first before they can disperse you any of the money, which is again incredibly troublesome for students and probably one of the reasons why a lot of students don't even want to end up applying for scholarships and grants through the university because the university will and has in the past, chosen how to micromanage those types of funds when in reality it should be, a given to the student to decide what to do or how to manage that money. Um, and again, this becomes a problem when you're starting to do the math and they realize that these programs haven't actually allotted for inflation. So yes, a lot of students have to, push the budget incredibly high to make it through a school year because the reality is that $34,000 a year employment offer really is not much, right? Like if we're talking about being able to afford a house in California right now on a PhD contract, every single PhD student should be getting paid no less than 65,000 a year. That's just the reality, right? Um, So again, you want to make sure that you look into these terms and conditions and you look into the financial aid websites for the particular students for any hidden sort of like policies that might be interfering with your money. And again, this should always end up being pretty clear for you and be clearly written and explained somewhere. When in doubt, check out Reddit. Renewal of financial support if applicable. Okay, so this is where a lot of programs kind of end up losing students is because, and they end up losing students not just financially and like actual enrollment that students drop out and move and transfer to other programs, but they lose them emotionally and psychologically because these like if applicable situations, right? So these are loopholes that the university or the departments could take advantage of to reroute some of the funding to other places that they think, that for whatever they need to pay, um, leaving students with financial gaps that are unfair. And the student has very little recourse, especially if the unions on campuses are not that great. It leaves students with very little financial recourse to actually get some justice in regards to how these loopholes are incredibly detrimental if the university decides to like take advantage of them. So meeting graduate student policies, again, a lot of this goes into what you can and cannot do as a student. Again, this is tricky situation because technically these are employment contracts. If you're enrolled full time, you're being overworked because you're at 20 plus hours on top of a full-time schedule. you're technically an overwork, underpaid employee that's probably not even getting paid time and a half. And on top of it, you're considered a student, but you're in the gray zone as an employee. That is an incredibly detrimental legal position to be in because technically you're still an employee. But if you decide to, for whatever reason, push the boundaries of some of these policies, the university can actually try to discipline you as a student when technically you're actually an employee. It doesn't add up. Okay, so you want to make sure that you have some kind of legal background or you inform yourself as to what your resources are because policy is not the same as law. At the end of the day, if the university is actually creating a situation that is financially, physically, psychologically, harmful and economically harmful for the student overall, you already know that you're in a tight pickle here. Okay. So you want to make sure that you enter these situations with your eyes wide open as to what it is that this actually is and what's going on. And know so that you develop some like resilience and you also have a game plan for the future. Keep in mind, tuition rates change almost every year for every institution. So you want to keep that in mind. Residence requirement, you need to be a California resident in order to have California tuition apply. You also need to establish residence within like a year if you're not a resident, you're either from out of state or international. And just a heads up, the DMV is terrible everywhere, especially in California, especially with like real IDs. You have to make sure that you call somebody, by the way. Make sure, please. I went like 3 times just to get my California ID. I was so upset because every single time I had to wait half a day. So that's like a day and a half, 2 days just to get a California ID. Um, anyways, work eligibility requirements. Again, you should be good standing as a student. Um, you need to have legal authorization to work in the United States or have a visa to work in the United States. And you must like be up to date with your paperwork. Final transcripts, you need to submit transcripts from other institutions to the university and like have that on file. Withdrawing or rescinding an offer from the university. You can withdraw at any time. A lot of students choose not to, even though like situation can become incredibly stressful financially because it's a loss of investment. And once you have your foot in the door with something like this and you start doing the math, the cost benefit math in the future, the type of doors that like are available to, available to be open for to you with a PhD, not just in terms of tenure, but employment, but also like administration track and careers. Then you realize, once you have your foot in the door, throwing away this kind of an offer or like leaving this kind of an offer and wasting your time this way is not always the best thing to do. So, withdrawing is incredibly like you really have to have the worst of circumstance. Like it really needs to be life or death with something like this. Especially if you come from a traditionally underrepresented background where these offers have not been traditionally offered to certain kind of students, and specifically I'm referring to BIPOC students from underrepresented backgrounds or um adverse backgrounds. Um, so like you need to look at these provisions, like any part of the application contains misrepresentations. If you're bridging from a bachelor's degree program or another master's program and you're like going straight into a PhD without taking gap, to work or whatever, you want to make sure you graduate because then this becomes null and void. Like you want to make sure your transcripts are in and like you're done graduating. Um, your academic performance cannot drop. Um, You should not be like accepting multiple offers from different universities. First of all, that would be really tough and very impractical. Very, very hard to even think about doing two different degrees and two different programs or universities or colleges. Um, and you want to make sure like this sort of like last provision, engage in behavior that brings into question your honesty, maturity, or professional suitability. Or you are engaged in conduct that violates university policy. Um, I had a really long conversation with a lot of friends regarding this and relatives regarding this. We are entitled to protest. We are entitled to accommodations as students and as employees. Another reason why sometimes these provisions are incredibly legally harmful and misleading legally because, you know, policy is not the same as law. So if, you are protesting legally, the university can see that as a violation of policy. However, you are protected by law. So you want to make sure that you understand that your rights as a citizen cannot be infringed upon by any institution or organization. Even if they put something like this in nice, fancy writing, the truth is what it is. And you know, anybody at the university, if you decide to protest or you decide to, you know, demand your what you are entitled to, which is accommodations, your rights, etc. If they want to call your honesty, maturity, and professionalism into question, they are, they are university representatives. So their actions are on them. However, you still have your rights. I also want to add this because this has become an issue with me and with a lot of students in the past, and I've heard this being an issue with other students in the past, where structural racism is a very active thing, and you need to learn how the actual mechanism of structural racism operates in a situation like this. So if you're being denied your rights, you're being discriminated against, you're being harassed, and you're encountering, this as a systemic problem repeatedly over the course of a long period of time, you need to understand that that is a huge problem. And if you react in any kind of way that puts into question your honesty, maturity, professional suitability, that quote unquote violates university policy, you need to understand that there is such a thing as reactionary abuse. Even in a professional setting, there is such a thing as reactionary abuse. So, you want to make sure that you understand that you're a human being. Anybody's a human being. So if you're being bullied in a professional educational setting and it is persistent and it is consistent and it has all the flavor and like, bits and baubles of systemic racism, this you can just throw that in the trash. And I just want to make sure that people know that. So again, we reach the end with the terms and conditions are subject to change. Um, yes, they are subject to change. And most of the time, the biggest, the toughest situation a student can find themselves is when, funding gets withdrawn or the budget, like the federal like funding just dries up or disappears. And that can be really tough. And, you know, if there's a financial situation that becomes untenable with this, know that you have options outside of the university. Sometimes communication with the university breaks down for students, and you want to make sure that you remember that if you're in a PhD program separate to your original bachelor's or master's programs, technically you can still go back and access your alumni resources from your previous institutions or organizations, and you can whistleblow, right? Report anything you need to report to not just to the university itself that you're enrolled in, but to the Department of Education. You can let your former universities or colleges know because you want to make sure you do your due diligence. If it's bad enough that you think that no further students from a particular kind of school should be forwarded to that campus or that university, contact your network of people, contact your instructors, let them know, hey, maybe you shouldn't recommend this campus or this college or this department to your students because this and this is what they're doing to the students, and this is still an issue. And you know what? When it comes to protesting, um, you can do like peaceful protests, you can get violent, but you can also do what I call the slithering way and just hit them where it hurts, which is like reputation, money, and like reach out to your network and really spread the word or make a YouTube video, you know. Um, so you want to make sure that you reach out to your resources wherever they're available and they're trustworthy to you. And at the end of the day, um, again, this is still an employment contract. So you want to make sure you have that you understand that clearly that you are protected in that way. I hope that this was somewhat useful on how like PhD programs get funded, how they like how they pay students to attend, what it actually looks like, what it actually is, um, and just a little bit of like what the financial part of like an offer looks like and what is involved in all of this, and what are some of the like the hazards of taking on a project like this for this length of time. Um, Remember, like you are welcome to try to work part-time or whatever configuration of part-time to full-time somewhere else outside of the university while you're doing a PhD degree. You're very welcome to do that. There's nothing legally like that's stopping you from being able to do that. It's not recommended because you are a student full time for an extended period of time. Even when you're doing pre-dissertation research or dissertation research, still full-time work, that is a lot. That's like a 40-hour work week. And so to take on outside work, this is might potentially distract you. Sure, you might be able to pay your bills, but it's going to be really, really hard. The one thing though that I will say is that they cannot legally stop you. It's not recommended. And the reason why they don't recommend it is because you're putting yourself in danger of like breaking this sort of some of these um like good standing requirements. Like your grades might drop, so then like you need to have a minimum of a certain kind of GPA, right? So you want to be careful if you take outside work and you develop your career in that way that you're not dropping your academic performance, which is the only reason why they recommend that you do not work when you're enrolled in a program like this, right? Or at least you don't work full time somewhere else. Um, as it is, like I said, even when you're working for the university, you're probably being overworked and underpaid overall. I think that's it. I mean, I talked quite a lot. If you have any comments, questions, and concerns, like leave them in the message, or like in the comment section of the YouTube video. If you want me to do an extended video on something else, some other part of this conversation, please let me know. Again, I'm using my letter admissions offer as an example. However, yours might look a little bit different, and that's okay. Some of these are pretty standard. Um, And again, if you like want to compare and contrast, or let me know if you think something's off, shady, whatever, like let me know. There is no, a lot of people wouldn't post an admissions offer like this. You see them in movies all the time, like but they're fake. But a lot of times people don't disclose these offers openly this way. But there's nothing in writing that prevents you from disclosing this information. I only redacted some of this information for like some bare minimum safety, like my student identification number, or like my start date, just for the sake of some like protection. But again, while it's not traditional to share like an admissions offer like this in video and talk about it, I do want to be pretty candid and clear about like what the financial situation of attending a PhD program looks like. Um, yeah, so thanks again. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this video useful and eye-opening. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.